Well, good evening. We're continuing our series of video lectures. This will go on until we are cleared to go back on campus. We've moved on to a new topic. We've been talking about what Howard Zinn called America's Other Civil War, and that's the struggle between workers and capitalists in the late 19th and early 20th century. We're moving on to a topic that's, I think, directly related. That is the nadir of race relations, not 1880 to 1930. That's a term historians use quite a bit to refer to this time period. The word nadir refers to low point. So they're saying this is the absolute low point of race relations after the Civil War. And it's a time of great horror for African Americans, to be clear. And I think it is directly connected to the last thing we talked about, which is the fall of populism. These two phenomena, populism, the movement of farmers fighting for rights, for people who till the land, when it fails, we see a great increase in racial violence and racial oppression. And I'll explain why that happens. Now, so let's discuss this. You have to go back further in time to put this in context. Now, before the Civil War, you had millions of poor white people who were basically struggling to survive. Many of them were on the edge of hunger. There were southern states where if you were white, you wouldn't be allowed to vote because you had to meet property requirements. You had to own a certain amount of land, have a certain amount of wealth to cast a ballot. They had no influence. Rich white people, the big slave owners, didn't care about the poor whites, and in fact they saw them as inferior, socially, intellectually, morally. It's in that era that the terrible phrase white trash is used. And I want you to think about that. We've talked about eugenics. What do you do with trash? You throw it away. These were disposable human beings to the wealthy slave owners. They had no status, no influence, but they had one thing. Up until the 1820s, some whites and blacks, or some whites were bought and sold. They were called indentured servants. These were poor whites who had come over from Europe. They couldn't afford the passage there. Sometimes prisoners were sent over as indentured servants. Sometimes they were captured and forced on board ships. But usually, these poor whites wanting to find a place where they could buy land, have some financial independence, basically sold themselves into temporary slavery. And the terms were often that a poor white would get on a ship, and in return for the passage, for the trip, they would sign a contract where they would basically agree to be servants, unpaid servants, for usually between 4 to 7 years. They work those 4 to 7 years. If they survive, and very often they didn't, then at the end of that time, they were emancipated, and then they very often were given what were called freedom dues, a small amount of money to start their free lives, even though most of them lived in miserable poverty after all that unpaid labor. That disappears in the 1820s. So at that point, the one group of people who were fated to be unfree, to be bought and sold, to be forced to work often at the point of a whip, were African Americans. That was a unique fate of African Americans. The poorest white person was not going to be bought and sold. His children were not going to be bought and sold away from him. The poorest white person had superior legal status to even free African Americans. If they had a crime committed against them, they could testify against the guilty party. There were all kinds of advantages even poor whites had legally over even free African Americans in the South in this period. That dramatically changes with the end of the Civil War. And very quickly, you have the passage of 3 amendments that erase those social boundaries between poor whites and African Americans. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery in all states and all U.S. territories. The 14th Amendment establishes that if you are born in the United States, including African Americans, that you are a citizen of the United States. And then the 15th Amendment, and let's remember the wording here, the 15th Amendment says that you cannot be denied the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Well, that's a good thing for African Americans, obviously. All those amendments, all the rights that come in that period. A lot of poor whites see that as coming at their expense. So this is where I want to introduce you to a concept. The concept of the zero-sum game. This theory was come up with by game theorists, people who study the nature of competition in games. And so I want you to think about ways in which people compete. And there's some games where what good thing happens to one side is automatically a bad thing for the other side. That's a traditional game. Like, for instance, basketball. If my team is behind, we're 2 points behind the other team. The clock is running out. I shoot a 3-point shot. Just as the clock expires, the ball goes to the hoop. Our team wins by 1 point. The great thing for me is automatically a terrible thing for the other team. The other team loses, we win. That's a classic game. But not all competition is structured that way. So for instance, track and field. At least in the early heats, when we're racing, usually the top 3 finishers advance. I have a great time, my fastest time ever. That's great for me. I finished second, I'm advancing. Someone else sets the world record for the 40 meters, they advance too. His success at that round doesn't harm me. Or this odd example given what's happening with the stock market lately. But we both invest in the stock market. I make $1 million on the stock market. Maybe I'm buying up all the cheap stocks that are available now and then it bounces back. My neighbor, who's also an investor, makes $2 million. His $2 million doesn't cause me any harm. My $1 million doesn't hurt him. We both win because we both are achieving. That's a non-zero-sum game. Now, American race relations are premised on the idea what's good for one group is automatically bad for the other. We're encouraged to feel this way. We're encouraged to see ourselves in a winner-take-all competition. And poor whites were certainly led to feel like the political advances that African Americans gained meant loss for them. That as African Americans rose, they fell. They used to know, even the poorest white, that the poorest white was regarded as in a higher status than the best off African American, free or slave. Even if, for instance, a slave was living in the master's house, they were better fed maybe than the poor white because of their white skin. They were better off. But once those amendments passed, the perception of many poor whites is this, that they're rising and poor whites feel they're sinking. Why is that dangerous for the elite? Because now all of a sudden, the poor whites have nothing to gain from the status quo. And as Reconstruction ends, suddenly, and racial oppression begins to increase for African Americans once again, neither whites or blacks, poor whites or blacks, are benefiting from the system. And the danger is if they cooperate. Because they outnumber. If you add black African Americans, you add poor and struggling whites together, they're a clear majority. And what might happen in the minds of rich whites is revolution. And a lot of elite whites thought that they saw a hint of that 2 different times. During Reconstruction, whites and blacks worked together. They briefly take control of all the former Confederate states. They create the first viable public schools, the first hospitals, the first mental institutions. They have bankruptcy laws that protect your home from being seized if you are unable to pay your mortgage in a given year. All these revolutionary changes because of racial cooperation, black and white. Now the Republican Party falls at the end of Reconstruction, but almost immediately, the next decade, in the 1880s, whites and blacks cooperate and join together. Remember, there's a Colored Farmers Alliance along with a Southern Farmers Alliance during the Populist movement, 1880s, 1890s. They represent a revolutionary change, and I want you to remember something Tom Watson said. Tom Watson was the 1896 populist candidate for vice president. He said to his audiences, black and white audiences, he said, they turn you against each other so they might rob you separately. He's saying racism is a trick manipulated by people in power to turn you against each other so you don't cooperate and take power from the rich and influential. So this is a danger. So you begin to see racist laws aimed at restricting voting, and you begin to see segregation laws pass. During the time populism is rising as a movement, and it accelerates as they're reaching a peak of influence, and they become the law of the land, and they become an iron grip on Southern society, these racist laws, after populism falls. So an example of that is the poll tax. Now here's a poll tax receipt. This is for 1948 in Louisiana. What is a poll tax? Well, it comes from the Latin word polis. It refers to the public square, the public. It's places where people vote. You go to the polls, you go to a voting place. This is a tax that you have to pay in order to be eligible to vote. So that's describe why that's important. To vote in this era we're talking about, 1880s to the 1930s. Number one, you have to register to vote. Now, number two, you also have to pay a tax. Now, what they make this as difficult as possible because they want to keep black people from voting. So you pay a tax on one day. There's a set number of days you pay the poll tax. You register to vote on another set of days. Back then, African Americans often didn't have access to rapid transportation. They often had to go by foot. They often live in remote locations. So walking to and from the county courthouse to do these things might take a whole day, and they can't afford it. Secondly, they have to pay these taxes. And this tax receipt, 1948, it says $1.50. That doesn't say much. That's equal to $38 today, adjusted for inflation. Why is that such a big deal? Well, remember, African Americans are sharecroppers. And the sharecropping system was rigged to ensure something, to ensure that African Americans didn't get paid for their labor. They would have all these things fronted them because they started their lives as free people having never been paid for their work as slaves. And then they have to pay for the land they live on, they have to pay for the plow, they have to pay for the ox or the mule, they have to pay for the seeds, they have to pay this. They are fronted all that at the beginning of the year, and then they're charged interest. The interest rates were often up to 60% for a year. They always ended the year in debt, and then their contracts required them to pay off the previous year's debt at the beginning of the next year when they'd have to pay for all those things also. And that piled on top. So they ended up never making money. So to a sharecropper, that $1.50 is unaffordable. Now, some of these poll taxes were accumulated. And they go out of their way to make this very difficult for African Americans so they can't meet this requirement for voting. So Georgia, for instance, is going to pass a cumulative poll tax law. What does that mean? Back then, only men 21 and older could vote. So the first year that law was implemented, if you were a black voter or a white voter, and we'll explain how white voters eventually are going to be allowed to vote in spite of these laws. The law said you had to pay a poll tax to vote. Under Georgia's law, the cumulative poll tax law, if you were 64, or let's say 65, if you were 65, since the voting age was 21, the first time you pay the poll tax, you had to pay the poll tax for every single year since you had turned 21. So that's going to be 44 years worth of poll taxes. You're going to have to pay that very first time. They can't even afford 1 year worth of poll taxes. So here's my question. If the 15th Amendment says you can't be denied the right to vote based on race, color, previous condition of servitude, how can they get away with this? Because if you only list 3 reasons why you can't be denied the right to vote, what that implies, and this is what the court is going to interpret the law, the amendment as saying, that implies you can deny the right to vote for any other reason. So the poll tax becomes any other reason. It doesn't say you have a right to vote. It says you can't be denied the right to vote for 3 specific reasons. This is very insidious, very cynical, but Southern governments found a loophole in the 15th Amendment, and they exploit that by implementing these poll taxes. Now, a second way, so millions, by the way, millions of African Americans. Most African Americans are not going to be able to afford the poll taxes. That denies them the right to vote. Another way is this. Literacy test. They're going to require voters, in order to be eligible, to not only have to register to vote, to not only have to pay the poll tax, but they're going to have to pass a test, supposedly to demonstrate their literacy. I think politically they're saying, we don't want illiterate people who are uninformed to vote, but this is for a very cynical purpose. And here's the key. These laws are meant to, or these tests are designed to make you fail. So a couple things. This is the Louisiana literacy test in the 1960s. By the way, let me tell you a story real quickly. They gave a sample literacy test to Harvard undergraduates. This was in the recently, and they gave them the time limit that people taking literacy tests in this era were made to take. Not a single Harvard student could pass it. They all failed because you got 10 minutes to take this test, and you know what score you had to make in order to pass? You had to make 100. You couldn't miss a single question. And so here's the questions. Draw a line around the number or letter of this sentence. See, the wording's confusing. Draw a line under the last word of this line, in this line. Cross out the longest word in this line. Draw a line around the shortest word in this line. Circle the first letter of the alphabet in this line. In the space below, draw 3 circles, one inside engulfed by the other. Above the letter X, make a small cross. Draw a line through the letter below that comes earliest in the alphabet, and so on. In the line below, cross out each number that is more than 20 but less than 30. The clock is ticking. Draw a triangle with a blackened circle that overlaps only its left corner. On and on. Get to 20. Spell backwards, forwards. Print the word vote upside down, but in the correct order. Place a cross over the 10th letter in this line, a line under the first space in this sentence, and circle around the last line in the second line of this sentence. How are you doing so far? Print a word that looks the same, whether it's printed forwards or backwards. Go down to 27. Write right from the left to the right as you see it spelled here. And then let's get down to 30. Draw 5 circles that one common interlinking part. So you had to make 30 out of 30. You had 10 minutes to do this. And by the way, this isn't like the SAT. This isn't like the ACT. You're not given a book to prepare for the exam. And they would find ways, even if you pass this ridiculously hard test, to make you fail. So I don't remember the precise details, but there's a movie, Selma, that's about the voting rights struggle in Alabama in the 1960s when Martin Luther King went to Selma, Alabama to fight against voting restrictions because these literacy tests are in place from the 1890s until the 1960s in some states. And Oprah Winfrey plays a real-life character, and she was asked a question, as part of the literacy test requirement, how many county judges are there in Alabama? And she studied that. And so she had the right answer when she was asked by the clerk, the county clerk. She answered it, and then he looked at her and said, name them. In other words, name each county clerk. And of course, she failed. They found a way to fail you. Now, there's a dilemma here. Through these 2 barriers to voting, they did eliminate almost all African American voting in these former Confederate states. And by the way, poll taxes were not just a Southern thing, but in the South, it was particularly important to the white leadership. Here's the dilemma. A lot of whites couldn't afford the poll tax. They were dirt poor. A lot of them were illiterate or barely literate, and they couldn't pass this ridiculously hard test. Well-educated people couldn't pass the test. Like I said, Harvard students failed. So here's the problem. What they want to do is they want to make poor whites feel like they have something to gain from the system, that they have superior status to poor African Americans, even though in practical terms they don't. They want them to feel like they have symbolic power, that by virtue of their white skin, they're part of the ruling class. But they just disenfranchise a lot of white people. So how do they resolve that? That's when a particular trick is embraced that will follow the dictates of the 15th Amendment. These literacy tests, these poll taxes don't mention race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So they have to be careful. They can't mention any of those 3 things, but they want to let white people vote without letting black people vote. That's when you have the implementation of what are called grandfather clauses. What is a grandfather clause? Well, not all Southern states adopt this, but here's how it works. It essentially makes the right to vote hereditary. And it makes you exempt if you are able to demonstrate that you had an ancestor who could vote before the Civil War. Then you don't have to pay a poll tax. You don't have to pay a literacy test. You inherit that right to vote because your grandparent or parent or whoever, any ancestor would allow you to vote even if you couldn't meet those 2 requirements. So why would that affect black people and not affect white people? Well, who were the grandparents of African Americans in this era? They were either slaves who couldn't vote, or based on the laws before the 15th Amendment, you could be denied the right to vote based on race. White people had ancestors who could vote. So, without mentioning race, color, or previous condition of servitude, the grandfather clauses open up the vote for white people who can't pay the poll tax or pay the literacy test. It closes the door shut for black people because they can't escape those requirements because of who their ancestors were. And they do it without technically violating the 15th Amendment, although they violate the spirit. One last thing, and we'll call it a break for now. These laws stay on the books for a very long time. The grandfather clauses are not ruled unconstitutional until a Supreme Court decision called Gwynne v. United States. Gwynne versus the United States. That's a decision that was reached by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1915. That's a clearly naked attempt to get around the wording of the 15th Amendment. Poll taxes are not going to be banned until the ratification of the 24th Amendment, and that's in 1964. Literacy tests are not going to be prohibited completely until the Congress adds wording that was not included in the original 1965 Voting Rights Act. In 1970, they amend the Voting Rights Act. In 1970, they outlaw finally, permanently, the literacy test. So you have the literacy test, for instance, legal for 80 years, 8 decades. Poll taxes in place for more than 70 years. And generations of African Americans can't vote. To give you an example what the effect of the poll taxes and literacy tests were, in Mississippi, black voting dropped 99%. From 130,000 African Americans casting ballots in 1870 to only 1,300 in the year 1900. These tests stripped African Americans of the rights they wanted to vote, that they fought for in the Union Army. African Americans who aided the North during the Civil War, they paid in blood and sweat. They dealt with terrorism. They won the right to vote, and it was stripped from them, and partly in reaction to the failure of populism. So we'll continue. We'll talk about segregation, which is the next set of racist laws that are implemented in this era. Thank you.